Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Harold Goldberg, and I'm a board member of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, JCPA, and will be moderating today's discussion. JCPA is the national network hub of the Jewish Community Relations Network, representing 125 local JCRCs and 16 national Jewish organizations. JCPA comes together to grapple with the pressing issues of the day, build consensus, and then advocates with other racial, ethnic, faith, and civic leaders to build a just and pluralistic America and support efforts for Israel's peace and security. For the next hour, we will be discussing a current event that is top of mind for so many of us, understanding the recent hostilities with Israel and Hamas and its implications for Israel's future. Israel is very much in the news these days, and it's changing by the minute, as 4,000 rockets were launched at it from Hamas, creating havoc and hostilities for both Israelis and Palestinians. After 11 days of fighting, there is now a ceasefire in place. Additionally, we've heard announcements that there's a new president yesterday and possibly a new prime minister as of today. Today, we will hear from our esteemed panel that will help us to have a clear understanding of the big picture as they address the following issues. What led to the Hamas-Israeli hostilities? Was Israel's strategic response justified? What is taking place within Israel's post-ceasefire to heal the country and ensure its safety? Is the two-state solution still alive? And what are the other options for peace between the Palestinians and Israelis and the hopes for coexistence inside and outside of Israel? How should we understand the violence between Israelis and Arab Israelis? And where do we go from here? This morning, we learned about last night about the new prime minister and the new coalition. What does this mean for Israel and the Palestinian peace opportunities? And what can we expect from these changes in leadership? After the panelists have presented, we'll open up Q&A. If you have a question, feel free to write your question in the Q&A box on the bottom of your webinar screen. Let me introduce our speakers. David Mccoskey will go first. He is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and Director of the Koret Project on Arab-Israeli Relations. He is also an adjunct professor in Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University's Paul H. Nimitz School of Advanced International Studies. In 2013 and 14, he worked in the Office of the U.S. Secretary of State, serving as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Tamara Cofman Wittes, who will go second, is a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings, where she focuses on U.S. policy and Middle East. Wittes served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from November of 2009 to January of 2012, coordinating U.S. policy on democracy and human rights in the Middle East during the Arab uprisings. And Ghaith al-Omari, a senior fellow at the Washington Institute's Irwin Levy Family Program on the U.S.-Israeli strategic relationship and the former executive director of the American Task Force on Palestine. He served as advisor to negotiating team during the 1999-2001 permanent status talks, in addition to holding various other positions within the Palestinian Authority. So we're going to begin with David. Please take it away from Jerusalem.
Thank you, Harold, for the kind introduction. And thank you, Melanie, for inviting me, and Chaya for arranging things. Look, I guess this thing happens in the Middle East. You know, these big mega events come in bunches. We've both the Israeli political news that is dominating in the last 48 hours, and the Gaza aftermath. Just arrived, haven't been here since the Corona, since the pandemic, trying to talk to everyone I can. I got permission from Melanie to try to touch on both in this little time I have here. So it's going to be part Israeli politics, part the Gaza aftermath, the policy implications, and my esteemed colleagues who I'm really honored to share a Zoom platform with, Tamara and Ghaith, will provide added perspectives, I'm sure, on both, maybe more on the Gaza situation, but we'll all talk about everything. So why don't I just start to dive in right now? Again, thank JCPA for inviting me. Look, the big political earthquake in Israel, and one day Israel woke up in the morning. The president of the country was Ruby Rivlin. The prime minister was Benjamin Netanyahu. It went last night with a new president, Bougie Herzog, who's known to many of you, former head of the Jewish Agency, and son of Chaim Herzog, the former president. Today's Israeli headlines, blared Herzog II as a new president. And as of a few minutes to midnight, right before the deadline, Yair Lapid, centrist Israeli leader, talk show host, son of a Holocaust survivor, was a very prominent Israeli journalist and politician, announced that with Naphtali Bennett, he was forming a new government. And it's a government that is extraordinary. I've been following Israeli politics for close to 40 years. I don't remember anything like this. Some unity governments, I can't resist sports analogies, and I'm sure Ghaith is smiling, is like 30-yard line to 30-yard line. Now you've got end zone to end zone, 100-yard line difference, right, center, left, Arab, all united in a belief that Israel has had 4 elections, can't afford a 5th, and the prime minister, who is very talented in many ways, however, is mired in a corruption trial, and that is coloring his representation of Israeli institutions that the Zionists have been proud of ever since the formation of the country 73 years ago. So 8 factions, and for the first time in history, an Israeli-Arab faction that we'll talk about in a moment. So why don't I just talk about some of the key people here. First is the guy who you're going to learn a lot about. Some of you might already know him, Naphtali Bennett. His parents are from the San Francisco area. He came to Israel as a kid. He's a very improbable choice, maybe, because he maybe doesn't have the same seasoning of other Israeli leaders. He had attacked Netanyahu from the right for a while. He's like Netanyahu, not just that he speaks an idiomatic American English, but he served in the same commando unit as Netanyahu, Sayeret Matkal. He even worked for Netanyahu as his chief of staff, but he's a generational shift from Netanyahu. And he's like, I believe, 48 years old, 49, and Netanyahu's 71. And he's someone who's had multiple startup companies and is a multimillionaire at this point. He's someone who was attacking Netanyahu from the right for a while, and now here he is joining this hybrid unity government with parties right, center, and left, and Arab. So we'll talk a little bit more about him. Yair Lapid is the kingmaker of this government. I mentioned him at the outset. He's the central figure in stitching together this coalition. He's a former talk show host. He realized during the campaign, Bennett holds the balance of power. You could say it's an act of political chivalry. It was also the mathematics of it. The arithmetic of it was that Bennett might only get 7 seats and he had 17, but Bennett would be the decisive factor. So he has ceded the premiership to Bennett in the first 2-year out of 4-year stint. And then they're going to flip positions. He will be the foreign minister, while Bennett is the prime minister, and then the reverse. A guy who is not known to an American Jewish audience is this fellow, Mansour Abbas. He's the leader of the United Arab List, which is actually the Islamist party. It broke off from the Joint List. It's the first time, it's a historic moment for Israel that an Arab party is signing a coalition agreement to launch a government with Israel. There will be 8 Arabs in a government of 61. And there'll be also an Arab cabinet minister, actually is from Meretz, Issam Frage. The irony is he was kind of made kosher by Netanyahu, who in the first of 4 rounds, remember way back then in 2019, Bibi thought that he would put him over the top. I think the way he's talked differently, and Tamara and I don't know if we'll see it the same way, we might see it a bit different. I think he talks differently than the Joint List people, and that has made him more appealing to Israelis, Jews, in the sense that he talks about really civil rights of individual Arab Israelis. He's not talking about competing group rights with Jews on the character of the state. He's talking about we deserve services. We're citizens here. We have a high crime rate. We need police stations. We need basic services. He has spoken so plainly and so, I think, effectively. He's really reached many Israelis. And the moment everyone will remember was during the Lod riots, during the Gaza war. He went to a synagogue with the mayor of Lod, who's a known Likudnik, and said, I want to help rebuild the synagogue. That, I think, broke through a huge barrier, but it's still not there yet. So is this government going to happen, and is it durable? That's something I know people want to know. First of all, it's the Middle East. Nothing's happened till it's happened. This could go on for 7 to 12 days, depending who the Knesset speaker is. That's a whole conversation I don't want to get into because of the ground we want to cover. But 12 days is a long time in Israeli politics. And clearly the prime minister and his supporters are trying to identify backbenchers in 3 of especially the Bennett faction. But there's 2 other right-wing parties, one led by Gideon Sa'ar, who's kind of the Liz Cheney of Israel, who sees it as a principled issue coming as a devoted right-winger against Netanyahu. There's a Victor Lieberman, who is more focused on the ultra-Orthodox issues. And the question is Bibi going to be able to shake it loose and take away some of Netanyahu's backbencher? He's done one already. There's talk of others. All day they've been focusing on these backbenchers. I could talk to you for hours about that. I will not. But whether he emerges, I can tell you a secret, quote unquote, that I think there's a backup plan. If 1 or 2 more of these backbenchers leave, some of the people in the joint list may abstain. To give him 61, what you need, 61, you need to have a coalition. So the idea of this government hitting the road, I think, has a good shot, although again, nothing is done until it's done. I mean, it was a remarkable moment when one of the backbenchers, rabbis of a local synagogue, appeared on Israeli TV just a few hours ago. I said, this would never happen in America, where he broadly hinted that the prime minister called him because he's the local rabbi, one of the backbenchers. Can you press on this backbencher to stay away from Bennett and make sure this government doesn't come up? There's very intense demonstrations. The mood here is going to get much tougher. Each side feels that the other, each side is going to have a case. The people on the right say, Bennett, you said you were going to go only, go with the right. Although Bennett didn't exactly say that. Gantz, also, people on the center left thought he was not keeping a promise. But when you start saying, as Miri Regev said tonight, one of Netanyahu's right-hand people, or the transportation minister, the elections are stolen. We as Americans know what that means, and from President Trump, that had really tragic consequences. I hope things don't go there, but I'm worried about it. So is it durable? Is it not durable? Let's assume it happens. What does it mean? Could it work? Those who say, look, this isn't durable, it's based on one idea. It's Netanyahu's removal. And it has got the achievement maybe up front. But look what happened in Gaza. The coalition talks fell apart. So this thing is so fragile, it will fall apart too. Because the Palestinian issue is not something you're going to be able to finesse. And this government is focusing on consensus issues, a budget, infrastructure, post-COVID economic relief, COVID. Does this sound familiar to you as us Americans? This sounds Biden-esque when Bennett says, we got to heal the country, we got to stop the polarization. So I think they have a very kind of apple pie, motherhood kind of approach for basic governance, but will it hold? You can say, look, at the end of the day, David, this is the Middle East, man. You get curveballs every day in the Middle East. And you have a former prime minister who is not shy, relentless, and he's going to keep trying to shake the tree against it. So there's some who say, no way is this going to work. Those who say it will be more durable than people think is because of a couple points here. First of all, Lapid gave the most sensitive portfolios to political moderates. Benny Gantz remains as defense minister. And the police minister is not someone who someone accuses just, is an ideologue. But Omer Bar-Lev, the son of Chaim Bar-Lev, who was one of the people who helped liberate Jerusalem in '67. So some say, look, he's giving these portfolios sensitive portfolios to very centrist people. A second argument says, look, Netanyahu in the opposition, ironically, is the glue that will keep these people together. It's kind of if you either hang together or hang separately, metaphorically, of course. So as long as he's there in the opposition, he will be a reminder why this government has to keep its competition within bounds. Argument would be is, look, these leaders have kind of crossed the Rubicon. There's no going back for them. It's political oblivion for them to face a fifth election because they've gone beyond their base and they might be punished for it. They have to show success. Success is only through this new government. There's kind of no turning back. So those three factors say, you know, this will last. What could be a tiebreaker between these two schools of thought? Yes, durable, not durable, is the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox. If I was an American Jewish organizational person, and I don't want to, you know, say JCPA, JCRCs, or whatever, they might say, look, we have felt the ultra-Orthodox have an excess of power. Right now, they're going to be out of this government. Now there's a new president in Israel, even though the last president was very sympathetic. Rivlin, you've got someone from the Jewish Agency who has made the diaspora its centerpiece, Bougie Herzog. The combination of a loss of ultra-Orthodox influence and a guy like Herzog, this is a government that's going to be very sympathetic to the diaspora. It's a government that is going to try to build bridges with the Democratic Party, even if Bennett comes from the right. But Netanyahu has been a red flag, some would argue, during the Trump years and even before. So will it stay this way? And I don't know. I think the ultra-Orthodox, Bennett would like them in. He doesn't like the idea of being attacked on the right because of Arab votes that could behold the balance. And he has said to me more than once privately, you know, David, without the ultra-Orthodox, it's hard to be prime minister from the right. So I think he'll want them in, but clearly the ultra-Orthodox will not hold the balance of power like they do now. Let me just say a couple words on Gaza, and I'll go real quick because I don't want to take in my colleagues' time. Look, I think the president was very successful behind the scenes with his diplomacy. He did it the old-fashioned way. This president is a believer in interpersonal relationships as integral to his foreign policy, and he did it his way by talking to Netanyahu and others during that time. He kept the UN. He held it off. I mean, I was in the U.S. government in 2013-14. The last Gaza war went on for 51 days. 8 times the number of Palestinian casualties, although you wouldn't know it from the newspapers, but this was an 8th. And I think Biden did it very deftly. He did it while coming out with statements very supportive of Israel, very Zionistic, that I think were very important. But he also talked about the importance of a 2-state solution. He sent out Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, to try to consolidate. You have Egyptian mediators coming back and forth. Clearly, the U.S. doesn't want, and Blinken made clear, to have Hamas to emerge as the guardian of Jerusalem and to be seen as a winner in this in any way. He wants to see the PA, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, Abbas, not Hamas, to take center stage. So I guess I'm left with, just some final, which is, I remember the not just war of 2014 when I was in the U.S. government. I remember the aftermath. There was a Cairo conference, a pledge conference, over $5 billion were pledged, but it was predicated on Abbas wanting to come back. But Abbas's view is, hey, I'm not going to Gaza. It's scary there. No one is disarming Hamas. The Israelis, and now after 2021, 4 wars, and has never gone in on the ground. That's the part they don't always tell you about. Why don't they go in on the ground? It's bloody. It means reoccupation of Gaza. No Israeli government wants to do that. The Egyptians are not excited to do it. The PA is not excited to do it. So when no one disarms Hamas, you've got bad choices. And therefore, I think while Tony is right in the big picture, focus on 2 states, focus on the centrality of the PA, as long as Hamas is armed and nobody is dislodging Hamas, I don't see Abbas see what's in it for him to be seen as center stage. Could you do things at the edges, like having the Egyptians do all these construction projects using Rafah on their side? Remember, Rafah's on both sides of the Gaza border. Palestinian side and the Egyptian side, using the Egyptian side. I know that Gulf leaders have said, look, I don't want to put money into Gaza as long as Hamas is there. Would you put money on with the Egyptians and have Palestinian workers help reconstruction there? Could you do more intrusive scrutiny over dual use? Because look, they built a tunnel from north to south of Gaza. You know, that took hundreds of kilometers, at least 100 kilometers. A lot of cement was diverted. So you got to understand what went wrong here before coming up with a new solution. So all I'm saying is there's no easy answers to Gaza. If there were, it would have been done before. Yes, 7 years of quiet, but 11 days of bloodshed. I'm sure we'll discuss in the Q&A, and my partners will discuss the meaning of this with all of Israel's military achievements, which were great, 90% intercepted by Iron Dome and the like. This was the first conflict since Black Lives Matter, and it's a different lens in America. Israelis were not aware of it. My point is George Floyd never fired a rocket at Minneapolis. He never questioned Minnesotans' right to exist. It's a very misleading, disingenuous kind of analogy. So I feel the critics are not being fair, just like they're not being fair, some of them calling Israel all sorts of names. I don't see the United States having an Arab cabinet minister, 8 Arabs in the government. I think Israel has potentially off on a new direction, a new hope. It's not going to be easy, but I tend to think that this is an exciting time. And just stay tuned. There's no sure things in the Middle East I can guarantee you any outcome. But more than ever, it's very possible that we are now seeing that the end of 12 years of Netanyahu's rule. But I would never count that guy out to the last second, the last hour of the last day. And even if he was out, I think he could come back. So I wouldn't write his political obituary yet, but to get so many parties together to accomplish a new goal and to bring Israelis together, to unify them, to reduce polarization, I think it could be an exciting new day for Israel. Why don't I stop right there and just thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, David. Tammy, why don't you take it away?
Great. Harold, thank you so much. Thanks to the JCPA. You know, I can't imagine anyone that I would rather be listening to on the morning after a new Israeli government coalition is formed than David Mccoskey. So David, thank you. It's fantastic to hear your thoughts on this incredibly diverse and fractious government information. And indeed, you know, the fat lady may be warming up, but she hasn't sung yet. So we'll see how that goes. I think in many ways, even if this new government does not last through its full term, and frankly, very few Israeli governments do last their full term, it would still be a significant thing simply to burst the bubble of 12 years of Netanyahu and the sense of indispensability, the sense of inevitability that has attached to Netanyahu's leadership of the Israeli government increasingly over the last 12 years. And so I think that is significant. I think for those of us who study democracy and autocracy and have watched the trends in populist politics in a lot of established democracies, including our own, one of the trends that we have seen about how democratic systems push back successfully against illiberal populism is when a coalition, a wide ideological coalition of parties is willing to set aside ideology and in the name of democracy and good governance, unite to counter a populist move. Netanyahu has certainly behaved as an illiberal populist over the last several years in his discourse about the opposition, in his discourse about Arab citizens of Israel, in his treatment of the media. The only thing I would note is that he's not the only populist party leader in Israel. And indeed, there are a couple of populist competitors who are now part of Yair Lapid's coalition. And so we'll have to see, you know, whether this coalition actually serves the purpose that similar coalitions have served in other democratic countries to kind of create a democratic bulwark against illiberal populism, but it's an interesting experiment. So that'll be my last word on Israeli domestic politics. I want to focus my remarks more on how we ended up in the terrible violence that Israelis and Palestinians have been living with over the last month or so, and what I think that tells us about what's necessary to prevent a future crisis, and what is required of the United States government from here. So, look, I would agree with David that the Biden administration's ceasefire diplomacy was adroit. He did, I think, pay some degree of political price with his own party, and I think he may even hear about that from members of Congress now, in terms of the sort of public messaging component of it. But in terms of the private diplomacy, it was adroit and effective, and they should feel good about it. I think the question that is worth asking, though, is whether they should have been surprised by this crisis, because I think in many ways this is a crisis that has been brewing for quite a long time. I think the roots of this most recent conflagration date back to the diplomatic vacuum that we have been living with since the end of active Oslo negotiations way back at the beginning of the Obama administration. There has been no diplomatic framework that has brought Israelis and Palestinians into direct talks since then. There has been a lack of political leadership on this issue, both from Netanyahu and from Mahmoud Abbas. On Netanyahu's side, one reason why we've had, 3 major rounds and other minor rounds of violence between Israel and Hamas in the last 15 years is because of his anti-solutionist strategy. In other words, to argue that Israel doesn't have a partner, it doesn't have anything it can do except kind of live with these occasional rounds of violence. And on the Palestinian side, you've had Mahmoud Abbas take a very sort of reactive stance, not responding to diplomatic initiatives, not putting forward his own diplomatic initiatives, and instead kind of going to international institutions and other places to try and end run engagement with the Israelis. And both of these guys, while they are facing significant domestic challenges in terms of their political legitimacy and political accountability for very different reasons in very different situations, but both of them, I think, facing challenges. But the final kind of straw that broke the camel's back, in my view, was the not just the exhaustion of efforts at negotiated compromise, but last year, beginning with the Trump plan, and then with the Benny Gantz-Netanyahu coalition agreement, the actual walking away from a commitment to negotiate this dispute between Israelis and Palestinians. First, the American president gave the green light for Israel to unilaterally annex territory in the West Bank, and then Blue and White and Likud agreed in their coalition agreement that they would look for opportunities to move forward with the annexation of territory in the West Bank. And once you do that, you're no longer committed to negotiating. We saw last summer what began to happen even before the annexation was put off by the Israel-UAE deal. We saw the sort of disintegration of what was left of Israeli-Palestinian economic coordination, security coordination, coordination on a whole host of practical day-to-day issues. And we saw also the way this vacuum then hit with the threat of annexation gave politicians all the worst incentives to use this issue as a wedge issue, to go for short-term gains, no matter the long-term risks. And we saw how much room it gave to extremists on both sides, whether we're talking about, Tag Mechir or the Kahanists or Hamas, to seize the narrative. And let's make no mistake, that is what happened over the last month, is that the extremists in Jerusalem and then Hamas from Gaza taking over the Jerusalem issue seized the narrative and controlled the direction of events in a very, very dangerous way. That's what it looks like when you have no commitment to negotiated compromise. The constraints were gone. So the ceasefire is crucial. De-escalation is crucial. Refraining from the kinds of provocative actions that led to the violence in Jerusalem and the outbreak of conflict, all of that is crucial, but it is totally insufficient. I think what we need to take away from this crisis is that quiet doesn't mean there's not a crisis. There was a crisis before this round of violence, and despite the ceasefire, Israelis and Palestinians are in a crisis of relations now. And I know many in the Jewish community watching the horrific events of the last few weeks have felt deeply uncomfortable. And I guess what I would say is, I think we need to stay uncomfortable. This calm is, it's gotta be more than, you know, we have some respite and we need to rest on our laurels. We need to replace this crisis with a new political horizon. We need to feel urgency to do that. And I think the burden is on the Biden administration, if it doesn't want this issue to once again overtake the entire presidential agenda, not just in the Middle East, but overall. It needs to actively work to get these two parties recommitted to negotiating this dispute in whatever manner works for them. And figuring out what manner works for them is gonna take some time. I don't think that there is any use in attempting to convene some grand summit with the Abraham Accords partners and the Egyptians and Jordanians. I think what's needed is for the United States to encourage in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority leaders to do what they need to do to renew that political mandate and leadership on both sides. And we need to have ongoing, quiet, great. I think quiet discussions have gotten a lot done over the last few weeks. Quiet discussions with each side about what their urgent priorities are, what is getting in the way of their ability to recommit to compromise and negotiation, and what we can do to get them back on that commitment to negotiated compromise. I could get into a lot more specifics about what I think would be helpful, about what those political processes look like. I don't think, I have to say, I heard Tony Blinken talk about wanting to rebuild Gaza in a way that benefits Abbas and not Hamas, and I'm sympathetic to that. But I think we have to recognize, yes, Abbas needs to get over his reluctance to take responsibility for Gaza. But we need to get over our reluctance to recognize that without a unified Palestinian leadership, there can be no effective negotiations. And we cannot wish Hamas away. The Israeli government, I don't think any Israeli government is going to go in and reconquer Gaza on the ground. And they're certainly not going to do that to hand it over to the Palestinian Authority. So one way or another, the solution to the division between the West Bank and Gaza and the division between Hamas and the PLO is going to be a political solution. So that is another area where I think we need to do a lot of thinking and talking, and we need to re-examine some of our priors. The Palestinians, Fatah and Hamas came to a tentative agreement earlier this year that would have enabled Palestinian elections. The US was quite tepid, if anything. It was ambivalent. The rest of the international community was ambivalent. The Israelis were skeptical and didn't want to facilitate elections in East Jerusalem. And Fatah then fell in infighting, and that made Abbas cancel the elections. So one way or another, Palestinians need elections to generate a legitimate, effective leadership that can negotiate with Israel and can represent Palestinians to the world. And we've got to figure out how to help make that happen. I guess beyond that, I would say this about what we've seen in Washington and in the American conversation about this conflict, and then I'll stop. Yes, this was a very different political environment and political conversation in the United States than in previous rounds of Israel-Hamas conflict. Again, I don't think this is just because of BLM and the discussions that have come up over the last year, I think this is the culmination of trends that have been building for some time in American politics. My colleague Shibli Telhami has been tracking US public opinion on this issue for years, and he has seen among young people, including, by the way, young evangelicals, among African Americans, among Latinos, increased sensitivity to the human rights dimensions of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That means increased sensitivity to precisely the things that triggered this crisis. Evictions, housing demolitions, collective punishment, things like that. And so, this is something that Shibli's been pointing out for years, arguing that the Israeli government needed to take account of. I think Netanyahu exacerbated it in many ways by politicizing the US-Israel relationship with the help of Donald Trump. But we are where we are. And so that doesn't mean, by the way, that I think that there's an erosion of support for Israel. I think you've seen in the polling in the last few weeks, very strong American support for Israel as a partner and an ally across the political spectrum and across the age demographics. But there is concern about the human rights consequences of this unresolved conflict. And that's something that I know the Jewish community cares about as well. So I think there are ways forward on this. I just think that there's no longer any way to avoid finding ways forward on this. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Tamara. Wonderful. So I want to call on our last presenter, Ghaith, al-Omari, and bring us home for about 10, 12 minutes. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Harold. It's really an honor to be with the JCPA, and I'm looking at the chat with seeing some old friends there. It's a real pleasure to be with David and Tamara, both top-notch experts and great friends. And Tamara actually set me up nicely for my presentation. I'm going to be focusing on some of the dynamics that Tamara mentioned, but from a Palestinian perspective, from a Palestinian angle. Partly because that's my expertise, but partly because I think this Gaza war was to a large extent driven by domestic Palestinian politics. And the fallout also relates to Palestinian politics. And I will conclude maybe with a few words about what the US how we move forward, maybe putting some more kind of detail into what Tamara started and David started laying out. So look, in terms of background, Tamara set up the kind of big picture. I want to zoom in and what was happening within the Palestinian body politic that led us to that moment. Tensions have been building up within the Palestinian internal political system for quite a while right now. You all know about the split between Hamas and Fatah back in 2007. Since then, both parties, Hamas and Fatah, Hamas in charge of the west of Gaza, Fatah, the main party leading the Palestinian Authority in charge of the West Bank, they've both been facing an erosion of legitimacy. An erosion of legitimacy based on two sources. One, neither of them can present a compelling vision of how do you end the occupation and create a Palestinian state. Negotiations and diplomacy have failed in the eyes of many Palestinians, but also Hamas's approach was also proven destructive towards Gaza and has not brought the Palestinians any closer to their objectives. Add to that, both were facing domestic legitimacy crisis based on the division between the two parties and the horrendous poor governance that they both exhibited in Gaza and the West Bank. Fatah, deeply corrupt, Hamas, even more corrupt if that's humanly possible. This is the background that led us to earlier this year. President Abbas chose to call for an election, the first in around 15 years. And the obvious, the expected, the predictable happened. We started seeing a disintegration within Fatah. Fatah split into three main lists. Hamas was having its own internal problems with competition between different branches, namely the branch that was centered in Gaza that wanted to focus on Gaza, including to have security arrangements with Israel. The poster child of that particular branch of Hamas is a guy called Yahya Sinwar. He was being challenged in internal Hamas elections, almost lost these elections. So both parties came into the Palestinian national elections quite fragmented, though Hamas was much, much more disciplined and united. Abbas panicked, canceled the elections, put Fatah in its weakest moment, really maybe since the creation of the Palestinian Authority. In the meantime, the events on Jerusalem were developing, and the images coming out, whether it's Sheikh Jarrah, whether it is the coming from the Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount, managed to unify the Palestinians in a sense of anger. And I cannot underestimate, I cannot understate how relevant developments for Palestinians in Jerusalem are for Palestinians. Maybe one of the few things remaining that can unify the Palestinians around one issue. Hamas saw a perfect moment for itself to build on Fatah's weakness and fragmentation, present itself as the guardian of Palestinian interest, and that's what it chose to trigger this conflict by firing rockets on Jerusalem. Now, the day after the conflict, now that the guns have gone silent, if you look at the Palestinian political map, Fatah has emerged very, very weakened. Abbas was basically absent throughout this whole 11 days. He was just an afterthought. Hamas, and of course, Fatah will also have to deal with the fallout of the divisions that it had in the context of the elections. Hamas has emerged in the short term as a winner. Hamas right now is riding high. Yes, Hamas knows that this popularity, as we've seen from previous rounds, is fleeting. At the end of the day, Gazans will wake up, look at the destruction that happened in Gaza, and ask themselves and ask Hamas, was it worth it? And the answer often is not. And Hamas also emerged potentially as a winner in the long term. I think Hamas right now is looking, at the fragmentation of Fatah, seeing that as a dress rehearsal of what will happen when Abbas, 85-year-old, heavy smoker, etc., leaves the scene. They see an opportunity for themselves to jump in and lead the Palestinian national movement. However, Hamas has a serious medium-term problem. Hamas is stuck with Gaza with no way forward. Hamas is internationally and regionally isolated. We see its two regional biggest backers, Qatar and Turkey, absent in this round of diplomacy and in the ceasefire talks. And Hamas's ability to impact things in the West Bank, even though it might be becoming more popular, is limited because of Palestinian-Israeli security coordination and security work done separately by both systems. Where do we go from here? And here, I would say there are three different baskets that we can talk about. One, which is the most obvious, is where do you go from here when it comes to Gaza? And of course, there is no question that humanitarian relief for Gaza is a priority and should be delivered immediately based on no conditions. The real questions we're talking about here is the reconstruction of Gaza. And here I have tremendous sympathy for the administration's impulse to want to work through the Palestinian Authority and to exclude Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization, and we should never benefit it, or at least ensure that the benefit that accrues to it is minimal. And in theory, the Palestinian Authority is also committed to diplomacy. It's a partner, etc. I think we should strive to strengthen it. Yet, in reality, the PA, as David mentioned, has very little presence in Gaza and will not be an effective address. And frankly, the PA also has tremendous legitimacy and credibility deficit with its own public because of the corruption and with the donor community. So to me, it's hard to imagine if we can see a situation where the PA can be an effective actor, nor should I recommend it unless the PA deals with some of the governance and corruption issues that it has to deal with. The second basket, though, and often one of the problems, and I think both of my colleagues touched on it, is that we only, we remember the need to strengthen our allies and weaken our adversaries when there is a crisis. I think we need to have a more sustained policy with engaging the Palestinian Authority, not only in Gaza, but to ensure that things in the West Bank also move forward. And in this sense, I'm very supportive of the Biden approach of re-engaging the PA in terms of talks but also presenting aid to the Palestinian Authority. Yet we have to be very mindful that the weakness and legitimacy deficit of the Palestinian Authority has proven to be a liability to some of our US policy objectives. For example, as we talked about earlier, the issue of Gaza reconstruction. So as we engage and support the PA, which I think we should, I also think that we should couple that with trying to touch on the issues that have driven the basics of the PA's legitimacy problem. One, we have to reintroduce the idea of pushing for reform, governance, institution building in the Palestinian system. Without that, the PA, our ally in that case, will continue bleeding legitimacy. But another part of why the PA is having legitimacy problem is the fact that it cannot point out deliverables from its own approach of diplomacy and peaceful engagement with Israel and the United States. And in that, and I will conclude with this point, I think the administration's initial impulse in terms of how do you reapproach the Palestinian-Israeli peace process was absolutely correct. In the sense that, and I think, again, both of my colleagues said it, right now, a big negotiation, big international conferences, etc., to solve the conflict are going to fail. They're going to fail because of the political mess in Israel that David talked about, and even with the new government, the sustainability, longevity of it is far from certain, and of course, the Palestinian political dysfunction. Yet the administration's initial impulse, which is to look for areas where cooperation is possible, to show that, maybe low-hanging fruit, but to show that success is possible, is the right approach. And we should look for areas in which we can encourage Israeli-Palestinian cooperation in ways that produce clear, deliverable results to both publics, but also show that there is a partner on the other side. I think where the US, the kind of the post-conflict novelty is not in terms of changing the approach, but in terms of realizing that there is an urgency to this approach. And I think, in a sense, my impression from the administration folks is that there was a sense that we can do this on the back burner in a slow way. I think what they have realized, well, certainly the lesson I have learned is we need to be more energetic and more proactive. We need to engage the region. And I think this is something that was very clear from Blinken's visit, the focus on Egypt, which is the main player in Gaza, but also on Jordan, which has an important role in the West Bank and Jerusalem, is key. But what's also key is to bring in some of the other Arab nations, particularly the Abraham Accord countries, maybe others like Saudi Arabia, not necessarily to engage Israel. That's one part of it. But I think it's important for these countries to be integrated with the old Arab peacemakers, to integrate the new Abraham Accord countries with Jordan and Egypt to ensure that there's mutual support, and to give top cover for some of the things that we're going to ask from some of our Arab allies, as well as some of the Palestinians. None of this is going to end the conflict. None of this is going to prevent a new round of hostilities in Gaza in the long term. But I will leave you this image. Shifting policy is not, you're not doing a U-turn in a race car. This is a big freighter ship, and it takes time, but at least some of these ideas we presented, I believe, can start us on a new direction. Back to you, Harold.
Great. Thank you, all three. I'm going to ask you to come back, Tamara and David. We have well over 58 questions and 12 minutes. So I'm not going to go through and ask specific questions. I've tried to bucket them into some themes that are emerging from the questions. And just before I say that, I want to say that there is a recording of this that will be posted afterwards on the JCPA website and on their Facebook site. So there's a lot of questions around Hamas. How do we work with Hamas? How does the PA and Hamas work? Ghaith, you just, in an optimistic voice, painted a very depressing picture about how they are not working together. And one thing that is, I'll take host prerogative, I've not heard a lot about is Iran's play. You talked a little bit about how Qatar and Turkey have been the traditional backers of Hamas, but the missile technology and the knowledge is coming from Iran, as well as some financing. And there's a bit of a Cold War, or a very warm war, going on between Israel and Iran that I got to believe is playing into this as well. So maybe whoever would like to take this, like, how do we make Hamas, if possible, a partner, and if not a partner, a managed adversary that doesn't blow up into a war every 6-7 years?
Can I try?
Yeah, go ahead, David.
All right. Look, I was trying to say in my remarks, there's really no great solutions with Hamas so long as you're not disarming them. And I'm not suggesting that Israel should go in, lose a lot of kids, and reoccupy a place it's been trying to get out of, would have to stay there probably for a couple of years. So I'm not advocating disarmament, but all I'm saying is once no one disarms them, you're left with some very tough situations. So I think, option one, if someone is really thinks that someone could help make that case, you're going to need to get the Arab states on board. A lot of the Arab leaders, if you talk to them privately, they hate Hamas no less than Israel. The irony is the Arab League put Hezbollah on the terrorism list, something no one ever predicted. You could say, well, they're Shia, therefore they're in a different category. But the point is, if the Arab states, if someone's going to delegitimize Hamas, it's got to be the Arabs to do it publicly. This might have been unthinkable a long time ago, but the Arab states, especially in the Gulf, are more invested with Israel than before. So there needs to be Arab political cover if you go for option one. But I don't think it's likely, frankly. Option two has got downsides of saying long-term hudna, long-term ceasefire with them, so you don't have to face this every 7 years. We hear rumors they might be open to this, but what Israel has learned is what seems like quiet and the Shin Bet. I mean, we're not talking about sissies here. The Shin Bet, working with the Egyptians, were very much involved in what looked like quiet from 2019 till now, but they actually utilized the quiet to build these underground metro tunnels, as they call them, of 100 kilometers to divert cement. So, it's unclear if the Hudna is really going to be able to deliver the quiet, or it's just a way for them to rearm. But if you do that, you have to soon look at it as a triangle. You might be undercutting the Palestinian Authority. Option three, it seems to me, is that there's a unity government between the PA and Hamas itself, where this is the Salam Fayyad view, I think, former Palestinian prime minister that we all like, and we know him very well. But Tamara mentioned this. I'm not taking issue with her at all, but just know that the United States has not been the obstacle to Palestinian unity. There's been there's been a lot of efforts, I won't say 100, many efforts since 2007. When I worked in the Obama administration, we were supportive. But the fact is that it's Hamas and Fatah could never get their act together. So, the Fayyad plan is admit you're not ready for a grand deal with Israel and put all the efforts of a unity government to do inward reconstruction. But you're left with the armament question again. There'd have to be some international force that you had confidence in that this was not some diversion. But I don't think the problem is there. The problem is that the PA, Fatah on one side and Hamas on the other side have not been able to agree on any unity. So anyway, these are three options, and none of them are good ones. I'm the first guy to say that. I totally agree with Ghaith, though. Whatever you do, reward the good guys in this story and the people who stayed away from violence. To me, it was so striking. It got no media play, but I was amazed by it. The police minister of Israel announced publicly that Israel was able to divert its soldiers from the West Bank to Lud and Akko and all the places where the mixed cities where we had the intercommunal violence, because, and he didn't say the because, so I'll tell you the because. It's because the PA kept order. So the PA doesn't get credit for it, but I agree with Ghaith that let's reward the people who stayed out of the violence, who actually helped Israel in this regard, and that's Egypt, as Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority itself. So I realize none of these are fully satisfactory, but what I'm trying to say is you're dealt with bad choices, and we need to be honest about that.
Super, thank you, David. So I actually want to have a second question, which I'm going to direct to Tamara, which is, and you just started touching on the end of your answer, David, which is the internal. For the first time, we kind of saw this Arab-Israeli confrontations in a variety of cities, including Haifa, which I think was surprising to all of us. And I think there's many angles to this, but one is you've got a new coalition that has a lot of that has the first Arab full participation in the coalition, but at the same time you have a government that has been underfunding the Arab communities for the last 15 years, maybe longer. So it's not a surprise that it came up, but it all came up now. And I'm wondering, help us, how do we see through this? And where does this coalition go next with Arab-Israeli relations within the country?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And let me say also, I've tried to answer a few of the questions in writing, also just the ones that are pretty fact-based or where I could give you a link to something to read. I'm sorry that we can't get to all of them. On the question of relations between Palestinians and Jews inside Israel, I do think that this was a signal moment. I spent a couple periods of time living on a kibbutz right near Ramla, which is a city that's been 50-50 Jewish and Palestinian for many years. And so it's an area I know well, and it's frankly heartbreaking and earth-shattering to see the kind of intercommunal violence. But I also think it's important to understand that there were extremists within each of these communities driving this. This wasn't like, massive mob violence. This was driven by small groups. I am hopeful that we will see law enforcement deal equally with the problems inside each of those extremist wings. But most importantly, I think, is the role of civil society. And even while the violence was still going on, even while the rockets were still coming from Gaza, Israeli civil society mobilized instantly. Omdim B'Yachad, standing together, which is a wonderful cross-communal, cross-sectorial civil society organization. They weren't thrown by this at all. They work in these communities. They know that tension is there, and they were out doing demonstrations for a shared society, even in the middle of the violence. So I think, the best thing that a new Israeli government can do, and frankly, that others can do, is lift up that will for a shared society and lift up the work that exists in Israeli civil society on behalf of that goal.
Great. So in a couple of minutes, I'm going to throw my last question to Ghaith, and you have to get into the head of the Palestinian Authority. They're sitting there right now in Ramallah. What are they thinking about this coalition government? And it's got to be a fascinating conversation about how they're going to respond.
First of all, I really want to emphasize what Tamara said. We focus on the negative. Makes sense, that's what makes news. And I don't want to underplay how traumatic and potentially disastrous what we saw in Israel. But there were voices, real voices, that were out there. And actually, I posit that against the backdrop of more integration, Mansour Abbas in the government, etc. So let's take a big picture. What is the PA thinking? First of all, look, I'm personally very excited for the fact that we're moving post-Netanyahu era for a number of reasons. Yet, if you're a Palestinian official and you look at Bennett, let's just say that he is not the most positive person out there when it comes to Palestinian-Israeli relations. He was against a two-state solution, supporter of annexation, etc., etc., etc. So I think there is really very little hope within the Palestinian political system that the new Israeli government will be the one that will birth the peace deal with the Palestinians, etc. I do think, however, that they see opportunities to work with the new Israeli government on smaller issues of the kind that the Biden administration was thinking about earlier. Economic, some even territorial, security, things of this sort. Won't be easy, but I think they can see that space. But frankly, my sense from Ramallah today is that they're hardly focusing on what's happening in Israel. The main focus now is on the United States, seeing how the US policy will emerge, seeing how they can rebuild Palestinian American relation, which gives us actually in the US quite a lot of leverage, both in terms of pushing them to do some domestic stuff, but pushing them as we push the Israelis at the same time to actually cooperate in an effective way on these kind of limited but concrete areas of progress. So today, the Palestinian Authority has really hitched its fortunes with how the Biden administration is going to go, which gives us, I think, an opening to play an effective role if we remain humble and if we remain within realistic expectations.
Great. We are at the top of the hour. David, Tamara, Ghaith, I really want to thank you for a super informative and thought-provoking conversation. We could do it all again tomorrow and the facts will change. Everyone is watching this minute by minute. We really appreciate the time you've devoted to us. And I want to thank all the viewers. We had over 1,000 people on this webinar. We hope that you'll join us for future JCPA webinars and consider making a donation to the JCPA to support future programming. And for more information, please visit us at our website, thejewishpublicaffairs.org. Thank you.
Can I just add
Absolutely,
just one
David.
quick thing?
Yeah.
I just want to urge people who want more to follow the writings of my colleagues and mine, you know, Tamara at Brookings, Ghaith and me at the Washington Institute, our website. Go on, each of us have a Twitter account, at Dave Mccoskey, the same for each of my colleagues. I have podcasts, Tamara and Ghaith do too. So follow us, and I would love it to go to more communities in the United States. These are bewildering times, and you can reach out to us. And I can't speak for them because they're busy, but I think we would like to be available to the communities if they want further discussions. So I'm
Thank you.
just
Thank you, Dave.
throw that in there.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. And if there are communities, they know how to get a hold of us at the JCPA, and we'll make the connection and put everyone in touch with each other. Thank you so much. Lila Tov to David in Jerusalem. Good day to those of you on the East Coast. Bye-bye. Thanks.